Hey everybody, welcome back. And we're going to call this episode part 2. We're re-looking at this little Jamo Concert 8, also designated um, the D830 model. So they've kind of changed the name in there somewhere. And we're gonna look at this all over again. But first, before I get started, I want to thank Nicholas down in Australia. Nicholas sent me this really cool shirt. He knows I love drag racing, and this is a John Zappia shirt. He is the fastest door slammer in Australia, and it's a great shirt. It's printed all over, lightweight, fits great, love it. Thank you very much, Nicholas. He also sent me a second shirt. He sent me two shirts. Maybe I'll wear that one in a later video. But anytime you guys send me shirts, if it's something I like, you never know, I might wear it on a video. So thank you. Now, I had somebody send me one of these already, and there was some questions as to the driver's response. And the woofer response seemed to measure a little higher than a typical Sales Excel driver, and it is not a production Sales Excel driver. This cone, which in this model is typically an aluminum magnesium composite, this is more of a polycone, and it's coated just like the magnesium cones that you see. It is a little different. Even the frame looks different on this model. So they did have something custom made for them for this speaker. The tweeter may be a production model, but they had a faceplate made and coated to match it. So a little bit of customization there, but only on the faceplate. So the first one that I measured, the tweeter level measured a little lower than the woofer level. And there was some question as to whether or not that was valid or not. When I first measured it, I emailed the customer and I said, I don't know if we can do anything with this. This tweeter looks like it's down in output. Don't know if it's going to work or not. So later I got to thinking about it. I thought, well, let me look at it. Let me see what I can do with it. And I was able to compensate for the step loss on the woofer, and it matched the level. And with a simple crossover, it flattened out the response and it worked great. However, there was some question as to whether or not the top end was dropping off on that model. And it clearly had a dropped off top end. I guess you're looking at it this way. It clearly had a dropped off top end. So I looked at the factory measurements on it, and the factory measurements looked exactly like mine. I mean, to the T. But it also didn't say on the factory measurements what the lines were on the measurement. They had a line at 1,000 and at 10,000. And I'm thinking, well, the next one is 15 and 20. And if that's the case, my measurement on that tweeter that I measured looked exactly the same. But there was some discussion that it could be that that line wasn't 15 and 20, it was 20 and 30. And if that was the case, then the one I had was rolling off early. And the guys that I kind of went back and forth with convinced me that that might be the case. So I pulled the video and threw up another and said, we're not going to sell an upgrade kit for this until I can re-examine it, and let's look at it again and see if there was any issue with those drivers. And sure enough, that tweeter did measure lower in output than the ones that I just got in now. I had a guy send me a complete pair, so I have two of them here to measure, and one of them, the tweeter measured a little bit lower than the other, but within normal tolerances. So as soon as I saw that, and the top end wasn't as rolled off, it dropped a little, but wasn't falling like the one I had. So I thought, okay, we got something with some good drivers now. We're going to be able to do something with this thing. So let's re-look at this as a whole. Let's look at what you get with this model, and let's look at the measurements and see what I was able to do with this thing. Because I did, in some ways, you're going to look at it and think, well, you didn't do that much. But in other ways, I did a lot with this one. So let's take a look at it. Let's first look at the cabinet on these things. And the cabinets are keepers. I mean, they're well built, pretty thick, pretty solid, and they're veneered really nice. The only issue I had with the outside, the big audio jewelry on the back here, these are big honking binding posts. I hate large mass. These are probably just brass. And the nuts that hold the crossover on to this thing They look nice. They're gold-coated nuts. However, they are steel nuts. These guys actually use steel nuts and gold-coated them to make them look pretty when this is the worst thing you could want in the signal path. I mean, could have just used some brass nuts on the thing or something. Or why not copper? Hey, how about that? Steel nuts. Oh, man. Woofer's nicely made and tweeter's nicely made from Sayas. And of course, we say Sayas down here in Texas. It could be C's. I don't know. If we can butcher something down here, we will. We'll say it differently. We will not say aluminium because in Texas, it's aluminum. And here we say Sayas and Sayas Excel. So it is what it is. And if you want to say it a different way, that's perfectly fine. Now, let's look at the crossover on these things. Some good and some bad. I mean, the inductors are air core. They're tiny little gauge air core inductors, and there's nothing holding these to the board except the adhesive. There's no zip ties around this thing or anything to hold these together, so the chances of them flying apart there's some chances. Caps are polyester film caps, not even poly caps. So very budget level as far as caps, and the resistors, of course, are sand cast. Now, the wiring looks special. It's this flat ribbon wire, and let me read what they wrote on it again here. It is their Jamo high definition flat speaker cable, and this PVC jacketed cable tends to oxidize pretty badly. If you can see on here, the tweeter wire especially is already fairly green. Even some of the woofer wire, you can see on this side here, there's a lot of it already turned green. And on the ends, they don't seal the ends. They just crimp on a push-on connector. And so there's a lot of air that gets to the wire right there where it's unprotected, and that is completely turned green. So even if you do nothing with these speakers but go in and just put some new wiring on there, you're going to improve things by a lot. So that's it as far as physical aspects of it. Let's look at some measurements on these things. And let's first look at the frequency response of the two speakers that were sent in. And the woofers matched fairly well. The tweeters are off a little bit. For that pair, I would probably fudge one of the resistors in one direction just a little bit to bring them out to a level mark. But overall, it's not a bad frequency response if you just consider the fact that it's within plus or minus 3 dB. But if you look at the vocal region down here where it's in the 300 to 400 hertz range, and then you compare that to the peak way up there at 2K hertz, there's a pretty big disparity there. There's 4 dB range there where it's hotter in the, in that region where it peaks at 2K than it is in the vocal region. And that's a lot of brightness. And I know people look at frequency response measurements and they think if the tweeter end is tipped up, then that's going to represent brightness. That's not where we typically hear brightness. The brightness is usually in that 1K to 3K hertz range. Right there is the brightness. Those upper levels above 8K, 10K to 20K, those are upper level harmonics. They can cause some brightness if it's really exaggerated in that top end, but where we really hear it is right in that meat from 1,000 to 3,000, and this speaker is pretty hot in that region, and the tweeter level is down closer to the vocal region. Let's look at the crossover response. We can see it crossed at about 2,700 hertz. The tweeter's response doesn't roll off that smoothly. The woofer's response has a few little whoop-de-doos there. Not the smoothest of curves. And so let's look next at the individual driver responses. This is with no crossover on them. And you can see the tweeter level matches the woofer level pretty well. Woofer's got a little peak up there around 4K hertz, but that's outside of the range that it's used in, fairly past the range it's used in. And I don't see that causing a problem in the way that it sounds. Typically, the Sayas Excel drivers that have the magnesium cones have a lot of breakup at the top. That you see a big peak at the top, and that peak is a lot of ringing. I mean, it rings excessively, and you have to put a filter on it that really knocks that out of it to do away with that ringing. This cone has an amplitude peak up there, but it's not a lot of ringing. So not near as bad as the typical drivers that they put in these things. Also, let's look at horizontal off-axis. Drops off fairly well in the horizontal. And the vertical off-axis, we see a little bit of a dipped area there at the crossover point as we start moving up. But again, it's not that bad either. And then the impedance curve is fairly benign. I'm showing it drops to a little over 4 ohms, close to 5 ohms, right there around the 200 hertz region. And the tuning frequency around 50 hertz, something like that, 48, 49 hertz. So nothing surprising there. And then let's look at the spectral decay, and the spectral decay drops off pretty clean. You'll see there's a little bit of stored energy there at the woofer, right when that little peak is. And then you'll see an area where it's dropped off, and then you see out of nowhere another ridgeline just pops up. That's typically from an internal reflection in the box, where there's a standing wave that's re-exciting the woofer, and then that woofer is playing it after the signal's played. So the signal's played, it's stopped, and then the pressure in the box is causing it to play again. So that's something that tells you that they don't put enough insulation or stuffing in there to control some of those standing waves. And if we look inside, they have some of this egg crate foam in there that's on the sides and a little bit on the back. There was nothing covering the crossover, and that's all that was in there. So just going in and lining this thing with some no-res and putting a loose fill of polyfill or fiberglass insulation and just filling this lower section of the box behind the woofer should knock pretty much all of that out of there. So we got good bones to work with here. And so let's look and see what it was I was able to do with it. And let's just go, let's look at the frequency response first. Let's look at the new frequency response compared to the old frequency response. How about that? And as you can see, it's a flat line now. So, and it was pretty easy to flatten that out. It really didn't have enough baffle step compensation. So the woofer's response down here where the vocals were, where it was at one level and it was ramping up in that 1,000 to 3,000 hertz region. So all I did was just pull it down so that it's nice and smooth. So we got that brightness out of it. So it has a nice balanced sound. Let's look at the crossover response, and you can see that it's crossed much lower now. It's crossed at about 1850. The tweeter's reaching on down there now, a nice smooth curve, and has a nice roll off to it. So and the next thing I'm going to hear from some of you guys is, "Ooh, you're letting the tweeter play down lower. Ooh, that's going to hurt power handling." Nope, it's not going to affect power handling. Power handling is more affected if you're pushing the mechanical limits of a tweeter. You look at the FS area, or you look at the lowest frequency range down there below what it's covering. And if you're forcing it to play a lot lower down there, then yeah, you're going to affect its mechanical limits. You're going to possibly at high power levels push it to a point where it's getting out of control and it's going to distort. However, what I look at is not the crossover point, but the slope. And if you look at the new crossover versus the original crossover, you can see it definitely crosses over at a lower frequency. But if you look at the level at the very bottom of the chart there, which is at about 1,500 hertz, you'll see that it's dropped off just as much now as it was originally. So as far as it physically playing lower, it's not, but the curve is shaped differently. So we've got a curve that's a nice smooth roll off, and we're letting it carry out a little further and then drop off. Also, the top of the tweeter's range was dropped off just a little bit at the very top, and I bypassed that last resistor with a 1 mic cap, and that brought that level back up, and it flattened it out. So just a little trick, little tweak there, and that flattened that right out of there. So next, the horizontal and vertical off-axis, not much different than they were. It's different in some ways, but let's just look at the horizontal off-axis. 10 and 20 degrees off-axis looks really good. 30 and 40 degrees off-axis, there is a peak that develops just past 3 kHz. It's a little hump. So trade-offs there. it could have some wall reflections if you've got that 2 or 3 feet from a wall and you've got a bare wall. It could cause a little bit of brightness there in that region. If you tow it in, you're going to minimize that a lot. If you don't have it near a wall, even if you've got them towed out a little bit to the listing position, that's not going to be any kind of an issue at all. What they had done before that alleviated some of that is that tweeter didn't play down that far. It was already down in output. So it minimized some of that in that area there. But it's a trade-off. If you cross it high, then you're relying on the woofer, which is much heavier and it settles much slower to play those faster, shorter wavelengths versus passing it off to the tweeter more quickly. It allows for higher definition and resolution, and detail levels are much cleaner because you have something that has lots less moving mass playing that whole region there. So anytime you can effectively allow a tweeter to cover a range instead of the woofer, it's always going to have better attributes in that area. So a little bit of a trade-off. Off-axis, 30 to 40 degrees off-axis is a little brighter because of the tweeter's response on this baffle versus letting it play down lower. A lot more advantage there letting it play down lower. Vertical off-axis is similar to the way it was. The dip as you move up vertically is about the same. I use a similar order crossover to what they had. The dip is a narrower dip, whereas before it was a wider dip, but other than that, it's about the same. The impedance curve looks a little different because of the order filter that I had to put on there. It definitely still drops to, a little over 4 ohms at the woofer end, and now the tweeter end kind of matches it, so it's a little more balanced. Spectral Decay looks clean again. And if you see that spot down there at the bottom, you'll notice about half of it has been knocked out. And that was just from me just taking a little bit of fiberglass and sticking it in there. And that knocked out some of that little lump down there at the woofer's range. If you line it with some no-res, which is a soft foam that really absorbs a lot better, and stick a little polyfill in there or a little fiberglass, it should knock the rest of that out of it. So quality-wise, man, we jumped up big time. From this, we're going to offer a crossover that uses a large gauge US coils air core inductor on the woofer and an air core inductor larger gauge on the tweeter. We're going to do a sonic cap on the tweeter, so we're going to have a lot better resolution than what we had from the beginning. And no more sandcast resistors. We're going to step up the quality of those resistors. And then there is a poly cap on the woofer circuit instead of this little polyester film cap. So we're stepping that up across the board. All new wiring, no more of this stuff. 4/9 high purity copper in polyethylene, so much better quality wire. We're going to throw in a set of tube connectors that you can replace one set of these binding posts with. Just go in and install tube connectors in the place of one of these sets. And if you want, you can parallel the other pair to the tube connector, so you can use a regular spade if you want, or use the male tube connector ends that you'll get with the kit that you can put on your cable. And that will improve signal transfer purity by a lot. That's going to sound a lot better. And you can always compare. You can go from tube connectors to binding posts, and you can hear the difference for yourself. We're also going to throw in a sheet of no-res to help line this thing and control a little bit of the cabinet resonance. There's not a lot in this one because it's a fairly thick cabinet, but there's no bracing in this thing. So there's going to be some flexing from the pressure changes, and then no-res should damp some of that out. So we're going to do all of that, and the price is only $359 for everything. All the tube connectors, all new crossover parts, new wire, solder, heat shrink to seal the connections with, everything you need to take these things up way past the level that they came in the factory, and we balance things out so it's nice and smooth. So this will be a nice reference level speaker with our upgrade. And this upgrade should work with all of them, not just this particular pair, but this should work with all of them that are out there so long as the drivers are still within specs. I think these drivers represent in-spec drivers, and everything turned out great. So that's it for this video. I appreciate you guys watching. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't, and the little bell notification button, and you'll get notification of when we drop new videos. So, see you guys in the next one.